So we're here with Miss Linda Graham, and we're going to ask her some questions on Theodore Roosevelt, just his leadership and his legacy. Miss Linda Graham, do you want to tell us a bit about what you taught about any courses, history you've taught?
I teach the U.S. History 1301 and 1302. I teach it here with Wharton County Junior College. I've taught it with Houston Community College, as well as I've had classes at Rice University and University of Houston. Focusing on the O2 history, I have had some extensive studies that I have done about Theodore Roosevelt. His life, starting off as a young child with physical disabilities. He was asthmatic as a kid. His dad told him it was very important he build up his physical endurance doing things like swimming, boxing, but in those days they called it fisticuffs boxing. Everything he could do to build up his chest, because his dad thought that that would help him expand his lungs so that he would be able to literally survive, because the asthma in so many ways was such a debilitating and took lots of people's lives because they had no cure, no medicines for asthma.
Some people say it did save his life when he got shot.
Exactly.
So, what do you think was Theodore Roosevelt's legacy in the United States?
For the United States, Theodore Roosevelt did a lot. As president, he opened up the parks. He was very active in having the conservation programs that were going on that actually probably prior to that really had not been going on. He's the first president to really focus on conservation. He was a naturalist. He studied everything he could about animals. He would have runs through the woods with his children and with other people, whether they were visiting dignitaries or not. They would run through the woods to name as many bird species as you possibly could. Whoever could name the most won. Foreign policy. Theodore Roosevelt did a lot as president, but even prior to being president, when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy under McKinley, he had given the order for Admiral Dewey to send the U.S. Great White Fleet over to the Philippines with the Spanish-American War. The claim by the Spaniards was that they did not know that the United States was at war with Spain. What had happened was the U.S. had people that had property in Cuba. One in particular was William Randolph Hearst. He owned a sugar plantation in Cuba. But there were many other wealthy Americans that owned land in Cuba, and their concern was a revolution of the Cuban people rising up against the Spanish that were in control of Cuba. The concern was that these people would lose their land. So Hearst started doing something called yellow journalism. He was claiming that more Americans were dying during this battle than what really were dying. And he did it in the purpose to try and get the United States provoked into the Spanish-American War. Theodore Roosevelt, one weekend, it was a long weekend, and the Secretary of the Navy was John D. Long. He was on a holiday. Theodore Roosevelt came into the office and sent in a telegram to Admiral Dewey, get over to the Philippines, the United States is at war with Spain. And this was after the U.S. had sent a ship, the USS Maine, to Havana, and it exploded in Havana Harbor. Dewey went to the Philippines. A small battle occurred with the loss of about 28 Cubans, it's reported. Others have it at 6 and others at 18. Virtually loss of no Americans in the Philippines. So the United States was able to get a foothold in the Philippines through this in ousting out the Spanish presence that was in the Philippines. Then the United States focused on Cuba, sending more troops, and Theodore Roosevelt actually quit his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He went to President McKinley and he asked, could he create his own division of the military? He wanted to call it Children of the Dragon's Blood. The news media shortened it off to the Rough Riders. So it became Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders. Anybody could join as long as they wrote Theodore Roosevelt a letter as to why they should be a part of the Rough Riders. He allowed the U.S. polo champion to be a part of this, the U.S. tennis champion, and a few convicts. He had some Texas Rangers and quite a number of people because Theodore Roosevelt was a natural leader. He enjoyed leading his men. Now, part of the criteria for being a Rough Rider was you had to stay up with Theodore Roosevelt. And he is a person, if he lived today, he would probably be labeled attention deficit and hyperactive. And in those days, though, they didn't have that, and part of all of his being a very physical person, it also helped counter his dealings with his hyperactivity. So he was able to establish this military group, and eventually he sailed over to Cuba in what became famously Theodore Roosevelt, and it was painted by Remington, Roosevelt's charge up San Juan Hill, helping to take Cuba from the Spanish presence and help give it to the Cuban people for their freedom.
Thank you, ma'am. How do you think changes that Theodore Roosevelt made back then, any specific come to mind, it's okay, can be seen and felt today?
Theodore Roosevelt definitely actively opened up doors internationally for the United States. In particular, not just the Spanish-American War, but also with the Russo-Japanese War. Roosevelt was asked by Japan, hey, would you come and help? They were losing as they were trying to fight Russia and gaining more land, which was basically Chinese territory. Chinese didn't want neither the Russians nor the Japanese taking their territory. Theodore Roosevelt intervened and told both the Russians and the Japanese neither one of them was going to have the land holdings they desired. And in fact, he forced both sides to share the Sakhalin Island, which is roughly north of Japan. Neither side was allowed to have land holdings into China. Russia wanted a Trans-Siberian Railroad. They did not have a railroad that did not freeze over during the winter. So if they could build a railroad path through China, then they could get goods to and from the country out through ports where they would not freeze over during the extreme Russian winters. So Theodore Roosevelt really put the U.S. on an international map, also being the president to help with the acquisition of the Panama Canal. He was the first sitting president to leave the United States to go and visit another country. He visited down into Panama because he wanted to be active in seeing what was going on with the building of this canal.
Thank you. Why do you think Roosevelt was such a strong leader?
Probably a lot of it had to do with his personality and his upbringing. When he was in college, his dad had passed away, and he went into quite a depression. Eventually, he came out of that. He married after college, and it wasn't long after that he got involved in politics. He wanted to make a difference. His dad strongly believed that things needed to be done to help other people. And one of the things his dad did when Theodore was growing up, and he saw this all the time, his dad would teach